For the final episode of Season 1 of the Platform to Table podcast, theologian and Old Testament scholar Dr. Brad Embry shares his story of spiritual reformation. For the last 7 years, Brad has been recovering from post-traumatic stress related to spiritual and institutional trauma. After suffering in the workplace for 5 years, Brad finally found the courage to surrender his 20-year career in academia for the sake of his mental and spiritual health. Brad's story illustrates what it looks like to bear witness to the ministry of Christ while standing in opposition to leadership in pursuit of power, popularity, and success. Surrounded by a loving community at the Anglican Seminary where he lives, a men's group, a spiritual director, and a new leadership circle to which he belongs, Brad and his family are well on their way towards a new season of ministry. During our conversation, Brad shared a poem about a flower. It reminded me of Therese of Lisieux, the little flower of Jesus, who said, "Jesus, my love, I found my vocation. I will be love in the heart of the church." It was her surrender to a simple way of life that made her a saint and doctor of the church. Likewise, after hearing Brad's story, I can't help but think when he surrendered everything that made him Dr. Embry, he was embracing a new vocation, not of power, popularity, and success, but of love. Brad Embry's life is dedicated to becoming a disciple of Jesus and encouraging others to do the same. He's a university professor turned deacon in training for the Anglican Church at Nashotah Theological Seminary in Wisconsin. He also works as a pastoral assistant and is helping to start a trade school. Brad served for 15 years as a tenured professor of Old Testament studies at 2 different universities before leaving the academy to pursue carpentry and ministerial work full-time. Brad holds a PhD in theology from Durham University in the UK. While in the academy, his main area of research was narrative theology and the relationship between biblical theology and traditions of the church. In stepping away from the academy, Brad has become more interested in spiritual formation. He has since published articles on Ruth and Moses and the poetry of George Herbert and T.S. Eliot. Brad enjoys woodworking, cycling, fishing, and talking with others about their experiences with God. He shares this beautiful life with his wife, Corey, and his 4 sons in Nashotah, Wisconsin. I'm Sarah Carrera de Fuchsia, and this is Platform to Table, where stories of spiritual reformation are shared to encourage others on a journey of discovery of God's unconditional love. Hello, welcome, Dr. Brad Embry, to the Platform to Table podcast. Such an honor to have you here with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me, Sarah. I appreciate it.
Yeah, really, really happy to have you here. I have seen you. Well, this will be the first time that we have ever really had a long, in-depth conversation. We had a little bit of a conversation in our pre-recording, but for the most part, for the last several years, I have kind of heard you in my ear with my husband talking on Marco Polo. You're one of my husband's favorite Marco Polo friends. And he says to me all the time, just last week, actually, we were walking down the street with our little dog, and he said, "You know what? Marco Polo is really good for me." And I think that is largely because he has had good friends like you to kind of walk this journey that you guys have walked the last several years. Our stories have so much in common. And I think that God just sometimes brings us people for particular difficult seasons to walk with us. And I think you've definitely been that for my husband. So even though I haven't known you, I feel like I know you through him. But anyway, go ahead.
No, the feeling's mutual. Mike's been encouragement's not the right word. He's been a real lifeline in a lot of places, a lot of times. So I've admired his work and what he does, and of course, I've really valued his friendship. And he's spoken a lot about what you're doing, and I've seen that as well. And so, I'm pleased to be here, and pleased to talk with you. So this is great.
Yeah. I'm pleased as well. Yeah. He's also talked about, you both have studied in the UK for your doctoral degrees. And he has seen some pretty heavyweights in the field of theology and philosophy and just academia in general. And he has said that you're one of them. He says your intellect is just so impressive, and that you're just not just, you're a scholar of Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, professor of those as well. And he has said that not only are you good in that realm, but you also have a real gift for philosophy and just deep thinking and formational thinking. So, yeah, I consider it an honor to have you here.
Well, coming from Mike, that's a real honor, but I'm not so sure about his judgment. He
also said that you two, he also said that Brad and I are a lot alike. So you've just demonstrated that, because my husband is equally humble and sometimes self-deprecating.
Well, we certainly share a love of building things and working with our hands.
Yes.
There's a special grounding that goes on when you do that regularly that can temper some of your abstract thinking, I think, in healthy ways. So,
absolutely.
If you cut a board too short, it's just too short. If you have an idea that's not great, maybe you can argue your way around it.
Right.
The physical world, the material world is a quick judge of right or wrong. So anyway, I think that helps.
It has a way connect. Of hemming in the ego a bit sometimes.
It does.
When you cut that board too short, it's like, whoop. there's the end of myself right there.
You made a mistake and you need to do it again. So
exactly. So. Oh, wow. Tell us a little bit about where you're at now. What your surroundings look like there.
Yeah, we are, for the last year, we moved a year ago to southeastern Wisconsin.
Yeah.
We're in a little town called Nashotah. I'm at Nashotah House Theological Seminary. I'm not teaching. I came as a student to do a diploma in Anglican studies, and I'm partway through that program. I'm taking a leave of absence this year to explore a couple of job opportunities that have come my way. Mm-hmm. But we still live residentially on campus.
So you're there with your wife, Corey, and tell me about your kids. Like, how many kids do you have again?
4 boys.
Okay.
The oldest, 18, 15, 13, and 10. The oldest senior in high school. So we're kind of navigating the next phase of life with him and the conversations that surround that. We moved on campus again. Spent a lot of years living on campus, and I'm middle-aged now, moved back on campus, which has been really, it's a lovely community, a lot of generous people, and a strong sense of shared space with each other. And
I'm envious. Wisconsin, that whole area up there, so beautiful. So beautiful.
It really is. Yeah. The seminary is situated on a really nice lake. And it's quiet. It's in a kind of in a rural zone between Madison and Milwaukee. So it's really pleasant. We've really enjoyed it. Yeah.
Really nice. Well, I'm looking forward to hearing more about your journey to this place. Because like you said, you are in training now, back in the classroom as an academic of the highest order, back in the classroom. And I want to know how this all kind of unfolded for you. So shall we start kind of at the beginning?
Sure.
All right. Okay. Well, I always like to start with the question about narrative and the narrative that kind of underscores our life. Because that is what our story springs forth from. And now that we're middle-aged, like you mentioned, after we leave, our story will live on after us, after we've left in this earth. So as you're pondering your story that you're about to share with us today, or you reflect on your story at this time of middle age in your life, what is it that you want people to hear come forth, or what has been maybe most meaningful for you in terms of who you know God to be and who you have discovered yourself to be and what you believe to be true about others?
I'm still navigating a transition that's
Right.
been filled with a lot of personal and vocational turmoil, such that it's proven really challenging for me to sort of like identify what are the fruits of this particular journey. You know,
Right.
I know some of what's been stripped away, and I know a lot of what's been stripped away, and some of that stripping away has revealed areas of my own, what I would say my own spiritual life, or my attention to my interior life, that were probably wanting. I didn't have a lot there once I lost some of the external sort of elements to my life. And that was really eye-opening. But what's replaced it has not been something that I could sort of like chart a path for people to go through. It doesn't mean I'm not thinking about it. And it has led me to like some conclusions about, the spiritual life and the journey with God and what that might look like. So in a lot of ways, for me, it's a little more, at this point, it's a little more process driven than it is like definitions or outcomes with God. Now, I think that may be part of the way of describing the nature of God as God's being revealed to me through this season. But the way of putting it is like, so one of the challenges in this season of my story is just navigating a whole host of what appear to me, and I think to some extent are truly failures in my own life. And not like, I decided I was going to rob a bank or something like that, but just that I had worked really hard. I had attended to all of the things that I needed to attend to in my academic career. I'd made mistakes here and there. I hadn't treated somebody the way I should have treated them. But by and large, I did the work that I was supposed to do.
Right.
My desire was right. I was doing it because I wanted to serve the Lord, and I wanted to teach others how to deepen their own, their own faith and connection with in particular with the biblical text, which was my area, and how that might inform their own interior life. And I fell flat on my face. And the language that I'd had for God and my relationship with God either was not entirely adequate, or this whole spiritual thing was not true.
Wow.
And
I just want to underscore that, because I think that I've seen that emerge in all of the stories that we've done so far, that people do get to this place where they are faced with these two paths. Either none of this is true, or it's just not big enough, or it's just not grand enough to encapsulate who God really is.
Yeah, and the effect that it had on me, which I think if I was to say this is one of the constructive elements that came out of it, is that I knew that in order for me to let go of my own spiritual life and just say, fully to all of it, was probably ultimately being untrue to myself. It was true to some of the reality that I thought I saw around me, but it wasn't true it wasn't actually true in the depths of my being. I knew that my commitment to the spiritual journey, the Christian faith, to Christian spirituality, was not conditioned by the external forces that were around me. So I needed to start to cultivate language that, and
right,
some sort of
like
framework.
Embody that.
Yeah,
more than just like intellectually contain it.
You got it.
Just to embody it.
And what the effect that it had was, I look at this as it's a little bit odd in a way, but maybe it's exactly how it has to happen in my own specific sort of experience, or had to happen in my own specific sort of experience. It made my world, my spiritual world, very small, because it reduced my capacity to think ahead. Was sharp. Like, think ahead, like, okay, if I do this, then the outcomes are going to be these, and then that's going to set me on this path, and that's going to ultimately lead me to this. I couldn't think that way any longer, because I felt like that approach to spirituality had been destroyed in the process that I had experienced in the past. I don't think that approach, if someone else were to hold it, is wrong. I just think that there needs to be some level of caution in sort of saying, if you do A, B, and C, your outcomes are going to be, 1, 2, and 3, and you'll be fine, because that doesn't always work that way. So the approach that I started to kind of work forward with was that each day there were spiritual scents, like the smell of something. Like if you're out and you smell something, there was something in that day that was leading you to the next step, but there wasn't a place that you were tracking. You were on the trail of something and you were tracking it, but you didn't know where that thing was. It's like tracking a wild animal. There's this book called, and I forget the author now. I forget his name. I'm so sorry, but The Lion Tracker's Guide to Life, which was really, really helpful in this. And he talks about these big game trackers in Africa. And there's this African guy who was a really well-known tracker. And he had this statement, I hope I get it right, is that I don't know where I'm going, but I know how to get there. And
that's a good one.
What he meant by it was that there's some animal out there that he is tracking. He has no idea where it is, because it could be anywhere, but he knows how to follow the thing that is in front of him.
Wow.
So whatever the sign is, like a footprint or a broken twig, he knows to continue that way, but he has no idea where that's going to go. So a lot of what I was doing was in, building systems of thought that you could sort of, and whether I intended it or not, I think this is how they functioned, is that you can then provide to somebody, and then they can kind of work through that, and it's going to build up this life. And what happened to me is that, for me personally, that just collapsed. And so a lot of what I had been thinking, and I think some of it was exposing like spiritual shortcomings for me, in the sense that I just didn't have the resources available. But I do think there was an element to that for like living a healthy, vibrant spiritual life, is that it's almost impossible to offer somebody just a scripted existence. So what's better is to sort of, at least, and again, speaking autobiographically, but maybe someone can take this forward in their own lives, is that it's better to take that day and listen for those sounds, look for those broken twigs that God is leaving for you, and move forward in that capacity, very slowly. And I think it's got its own parable, with the, each day to itself.
Right.
Don't worry about the future. But I hadn't really digested it in that way until I was face to face with it, and I realized just how desirous I was to have something that was really heavily scripted, because it supplied me with a sense of security or assurance.
Absolutely, yeah.
And when that was taken away, and those moments are incredibly lonely. Especially as I experienced, I heard nothing from the Lord. I had I got to the point where prayer was really challenging for me. And so anyway.
Wow. That's a really good introduction. And first of all, I appreciate your, honesty in saying you're still in this journey. You're not at the place where you're at the place where you can say, this is what I am aiming towards. This is what I'm tracking towards in terms of what you hope to be true about God, about yourself, about others, maybe your vocation, about the journey you've already been on. I hear you saying that you're tracking towards something that internally you feel and hope to be true.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not entirely sure exactly how to define that yet because you're still on that trail, on that journey. And so I appreciate that. I'm happy that you're on the podcast to kind of help, or just to be somebody who's sojourning with people who are still on the journey. We've had a couple people on the podcast who are, 15 years out now, but I'm still on that journey too. My husband's still on that journey too. We're probably, I think our Platform to Table stories started in 2010, and then it became a real hard turn towards the table in 2017. But yeah, we're still on the journey too. So we're sojourning with you, and I appreciate your honesty and your the humility and the inner strength, the quiet confidence and strength it takes to be vulnerable about that, especially as an academic. I've been in those circles just with my husband, and I don't know if you would say this to be true for you, but from the circles that I've seen, it is their job to stand in front of people and say, this is what's true. And especially if you're teaching in a seminary or a PhD program that's about theology and philosophy, you've got to this is what's true. This is the package. This is the package deal. So that takes some serious inner strength and quiet confidence that I see. I just want you to know I see that because I see it in my husband as well, to be able to say, I don't have it all figured out. That's a mile marker in and of itself. So thank you for that. And then in your introduction of your story and what we're about to get into, you just described that you had this formula or tools or systems or thoughts that you knew A plus B equals C in terms of how to get to God or how to get to the next step as a Christian. And you're saying that became, your words were too small. You mentioned outcomes. Maybe your A plus B were no longer accomplishing those outcomes. So you kind of have illustrated an introduction to what that looked like when you had to let all that go and become open to receiving that thing that is much bigger, or going on this journey where you're going through darkness, but it's just one little step following the trail along that path. So tell us where that all started for you. What was your spiritual upbringing like? Or maybe if you feel your childhood feeds into that, you can start there. Or how did you come to know God and these ideas that you had built your life and your vocation on?
Yeah, like most people, I imagine it's somewhat complex, but it's raised in a Christian household. We attended through my fifth grade year a local community church. It was a walk-in church for a lot of people, so it's situated right in a kind of the inner city area, and so you're rubbing shoulders with neighbors. And my parents were. Looking back on it, I don't remember a time in which they were really together. They were separated through my elementary years, and I was trying to think about this today. I think it was in my sixth grade year the divorce was finalized, and that was the moment when my mom, the local community church, partly because of the neighborhood dynamic, became kind of an unsafe place for her in relationship to the split. And so she ended up taking us out we drove across town to this big non-denominational church that had formerly been in the Assemblies of God, I think, but was an independent charismatic church. So from middle school through my high school years was spent at that non-denominational big kind of mega church for our city.
Wow.
And it was formative in a way, but not really. It was formative in the sense that I knew that it wasn't, I didn't like what was going on.
Okay.
But it was also formative in the sense that there were elements of that people that I met. There were a bunch of charlatans who worked there and who worshiped there. But there were also a lot of people that, prayerfully, this was very real to them, this Pentecostal charismatic experience. And the vibrancy of the Spirit, at work in their lives to sustain them through all sorts of things. And that was a real lifeline for my mom. But that was kind of my experience, my entry into Pentecostal and charismatic.
Wow.
Traditions.
Tell me about faith. What did your personal experience with God look like as a child?
Yeah, I think from early on I was committed to the faith. It was just kind of what I did. It wasn't that I didn't do bad things. I was a reckless kid in some ways, but Christian faith was always a big, was always an important part of my life. I think it was in high school when I I think formally and intellectually sort of wrapped my mind around this as as something that ought to sit at the very center of what I do.
Wow.
But up to that point, I was pretty committed. It was funny though, because in the church that we ended up going to, that Pentecostal church, it was probably the first time, and I was kind of navigating this through, my parents had just been divorced. I was getting bused off to a middle school, I had walked to my elementary school, and I ended up going to a different middle school for most of my elementary school friends. And so I was in a kind of an isolated context, my parents were going through a divorce. So middle school years, I was not the best performing student. But I do remember still feeling very connected to what at the time I would say was like a spiritual life. I started to to pray on my own in the mornings. I started to read the Bible more regularly, those types of things. But I also in the Pentecostal church, I knew there was something there that was not right.
Okay.
Or if it was right, then it was not something that I would want ultimately to be a part of, which at the time was not like me drawing a line in the sand. But I do remember thinking what if this is exactly how this should play out? What is your decision going to be?
Wow. That was, you said that they were Assemblies of God. That's interesting. My childhood, I was actually raised in a and you know what? I didn't even know I have gone to seminary, and this is really embarrassing. I did not realize that Assemblies of God was, quote, Pentecostal until in my 20s. And I know that's really embarrassing, but I think it's because the Assemblies of God church that I was raised in was so chill and was actually super healthy. We didn't have, later in life when I experienced Pentecostalism and different, Pentecostal circles, I was like, what is this? Wait. And I'm not saying, I'm not making any judgments, but it can be a spectrum, Pentecostalism and charismatic expression and all of that. And, for sure. So I had a really great experience growing up in that church. So gosh, it's always such a bummer when you hear other people experience some of the charlatan or crazy stuff, or I don't know. Yeah, they had gone kind of deep into the prosperity gospel, and the pastor had kind of he
I mean, his sons were the associate pastors. It was a family affair, and
family
they drove
affair.
Fancy cars and went to the country club. So it was all those sorts of things. I mean, to fast forward a little while, just to make sure everybody knows how I feel. I mean, some of the people that I have admired most for their spiritual commitment and spirituality have been actually from the Assemblies of God and Pentecostals and Charismatics. I taught for 7 years at Northwest University, which is an AG school located in the Seattle area.
Yeah.
And I mean, there were some people there that I did not admire, but there were a lot that I really did. And I learned a lot from them and from their spiritual commitment. And all of that is to say that underneath everything that I've done, kind of through the course of my academic life and my spiritual formation, there's the heartbeat of, Pentecostalism and the kind of charismatic renewal that still kind of sits there. So
and knowing now that you are in Anglican studies, I'm so excited to hear where this is all going to go, because to see how all the streams might work together now in your life, I think is a really beautiful thing. So I'm excited to hear more about that. So you took us as far as, sounds like your high school years, you have an intimate relationship with God. You're praying on your own. At what point did you realize what you wanted your vocation to be after high school? Did you have an impression from God of a time when you felt called into academia, or how did that transpire for this next season of your life?
Yeah, I was a slow burning fuse. I thought I wanted to become a physicist.
Wow.
And so I went to Indiana University out of high school, and I learned I learned within a week.
Pretty quickly that wasn't your thing?
No. I had dual capacity. I was doing I was taking a calculus class that was I think we met 6 times a week.
Yeah.
The physics course that I was enrolled in was 5 times a week, or maybe it was vice
calculus
versa.
6 times a week? How? Yeah. No.
You met every day, and then you had a lab.
Oh, so, yuck. That's a lot. You got to be diehard.
Yeah, well, I wasn't, and I wasn't. I was with some people who were good at it, but I was not. I mean, I went through calculus, and so, but that gave me an opportunity. I dropped the physics course, and I took a course in logic. I remember nothing about it, but that course in logic and a classic, I took a course in music appreciation. Though that course in logic in particular kind of opened my eyes up to maybe other options going forward if I wanted to do them. I still wasn't sure what that looked like. So I ended up dropping out of Indiana University after a semester. I worked landscaping in the summer, and then in the fall, I decided to go back to university, but this time I went to Oral Roberts University. I had visited there through our church, and I didn't love it when I visited it. Partly for the same reasons I didn't enjoy, the Pentecostal Charismatic Church back in Fort Wayne.
But you were in the Pentecostal stream, and that's one of the routes that stream flows in terms of university. Exactly. ORU is one of the schools.
Yes, it's exactly it. And so I went there, actually walked on the baseball team. That was the main reason for wanting to go, was to try to play baseball. I was offered a walk-on position, and they had a really good team. I would have been an average player amongst really good players, and I would have done a lot of bullpen catching and backing up with people. But I realized quickly that I wasn't cut out to be a baseball player at that level. Those guys they're so good, but their mentality is baseball all the time, and I just was not wired that way. So I quit that position very quickly, and then I'm sitting at Oral Roberts, not really wanting to be there, but I'm there for a semester. So I thought, okay, we'll get it. And in that semester, I met a lot of great friends, connected. I started a history degree and kind of connected with the history degree, and then decided to stay. So I did my undergraduate at Oral Roberts. I did a minor in modern Hebrew, and that minor put me in touch with some reading around like Jewish thought and early Christian origins through the Jewish lens. And that put me in touch with like, oh, you can pray and love scripture. You can study it in these ways. And so, between undergraduate, kind of junior, senior year, I was thinking about, well, what do I want to do? I'd kind of gotten more interested in the intellectual life, the academic life. And I started, toying around with ideas about going on to do advanced degrees in history, especially ancient Near Eastern history. And it was recommended to me that I do Oral Roberts in their divinity school at the time. I don't know if they do now or any longer have it, but they had a degree in, it was a master's in biblical studies, with a concentration in languages. And so you could go and kind of do all this language acquisition. And I thought that'd be a good prep for an advanced degree in ancient Near Eastern studies. Well, I took those courses in their divinity school, which meant that I had to do courses in New Testament and Old Testament and, those sorts of things. And as soon as I read an Old Testament theology, I was hooked.
Really?
That was it for me. And I switched, that changed pathways for me.
Tell me, well, first of all, I want to say that what I heard coming through in the last segment that you've just shared is you really did follow your desire. You seem to have a real keen awareness for entering into something, recognizing a desire, recognizing what you would need, and then negotiating how much you want to invest in this, and then quickly discerning whether or not you're going to do it, and then either staying or going. So I applaud that for being such a young kid. Like, you knew exactly what you wanted and which way to go, and gave yourself permission to make those decisions. So that led you to this experience that you had reading this Old Testament book. And tell me about that experience. What was it about that text that came alive for you?
Well, it was a worshipful thing. And we could talk more about what constitutes worship, but it's, for me, where I was, it was an opportunity to kind of give full flower to, a desire to know the biblical text, know what it says to me, and to do so in a way that I could potentially like carry that with me into the next phase of life in some capacity. I didn't know what I wanted to do with it, but it was an opportunity to kind of to sort of carry that desire. I liked reading scripture. I liked hearing it. I liked trying to understand it. And this was a way to kind of open that up. But it also, to read the biblical text, you needed to have some sense about you that was, you needed to be philosophically inclined. You needed to know kind of literature. You needed to have a sense of history. I recognize that the study of this text could be really enriching intellectually in a lot of different avenues and pathways.
Wow.
Not least of which is that it has a real purchase in a lot of people's lives, in the fundamental way of like informing their spirituality. And so that just really captivated me. And I loved what I was doing. In a way, it was sort of linked up with that logic course, at IU, where I was in an environment that I really connected with what was there. I liked what we were doing. And so, and that was the same thing. I just sort of fell in love with the study, and it was easy for me. Probably what did it most of all was I could get really lost in what I was doing in a positive way. Like I would lose, I would have to set alarms to. That's
cool.
Yeah, it was really cool. Where you kind of run out of time with what you're doing. You're like, oh, I'll pick this up tomorrow. And so that was a great experience. And it gave me a sense of, this is something that I could do and make a study of this. I didn't know what it was going to be.
Yeah.
Because at that point I just was not thinking about vocation. I was just thinking about.
You're just immersed in it.
What was in front of me.
What a contrast between your experience with that, your love of that, just being lost in your love of it, and the contrast between that and your experience in physics.
Oh, yeah. No, I was lost in physics for another reason. Yeah. It's I can't understand why I didn't do this.
Yeah,
so.
for another reason.
Yeah.
That's really cool. I think that's beautiful to look back and reflect on that and then just see, wow, that's what God's leading looks like, to be have a real desire and to be in love with something. Not that it's not going to be tested and tried, which we will get there, but yeah. So tell me a little bit about the lens in which you were approaching or were maybe introduced to the Old Testament.
When I first started in the divinity program at Oral Roberts, I really wasn't connected to any one particular tradition. And looking back on it, I think the best way to sort of describe it, I was just following what was really a passion and a love. And that's why I say one of the hard things for me to talk about, not because it's difficult, it's not traumatic, it's just I don't really know how to describe it to people when they ask me about why'd you do what you did. The best way to describe it to them is that I couldn't turn my head off. The only reason I kept doing what I was doing is that I was just following my nose. And so I just loved it for what it was. And the disadvantage to that later on is that a lot of contextualized situations that you find yourself in as an academic, they want you to serve their context. And there are absolutely times in which honesty dictates that you not serve that context, that you serve the authority of scripture or reading traditions and those types of things. And that can put you at odds with the context that's around you. And I certainly found that to be true.
Yeah.
Teaching, kind of throughout my teaching career, that was true. And that became a really difficult thing. I was not wired to think in those terms. I never have been. I learned how to, navigate those environments. That's like those politically charged environments or those socially charged environments, where, the context wanted a certain thing. They wanted me to serve them as the academic, to enforce their kind of what their conclusions. I learned how to navigate that I learned how to do that, really by compromising myself. And that was part of what unlocked the whole sort of collapse for me. It was after a while, that compromise just became too much for me. And so I had to kind of depart. So anyway, but that the groundwork for the interest for me was out of just a love. It really wasn't, Sarah, until I was probably in my second year of the PhD program in Durham, where I really started to seriously think about what am I going to do after I'm done? I went to Durham without any intention of doing anything but study.
Okay, so you went ORU. That's where you did your master's in biblical interpretation with a concentration in languages. And then that's where you went next. Durham.
Well, I spent a year in a master's degree program at the University of Tulsa in an MA in history. But it wasn't
an MA in history. Okay.
Yeah, but it wasn't a good fit. Not for the University of Tulsa. They were fine. It just wasn't a good fit for me. And so then partway through that, I jumped ship and went to the PhD program in Durham.
Oh, yeah. But that's great. Just jump right to the PhD. Why not?
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, when you're on a PhD track, you want to make it as short as you possibly can.
There was that part to it. Yeah. So, but it wasn't until I got there. I mean, I was studying with professors and academics that I admired. I liked what they did. I liked the looks of their jobs, in undergraduate and grad programs. but I hadn't really sort of like considered that this is what I want to do. And so the trajectory of learning for me was not like funding this, this organized step to, a lecturer's position or something like that. It was more, I was just kind of following like desires to my heart, my head, my interests. And then at a certain point, it's like, well, I need to do something in life.
Well, I think that's actually really cool, because then you have complete ownership within your sense of self. I'm doing this because I love this. I'm doing this because I find God in this. I am not doing this for external reasons, because once you start doing things for external reasons, then we're giving our power away to organizations or systems or whatever. And so it's really cool knowing just a little bit about your story, just to see at this point, God has really wired you. You said I wasn't wired at all. God has really wired you, actually, from what I can tell from the evidence, over time on your journey, that he's wired you to be someone who's in tune with what you really want, or your ability to figure that out and then to make adjustments to do things that are in alignment with who you really are. And that's a beautiful thing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that kind of reality, I think you're exactly right. But that reality was really slow dawning on me. Especially once you start, once I started into, I need an academic position, there's a whole sort of world that you inhabit, and it has its rules and its regulations, its do's, its don'ts, its one-way streets and that kind of thing. And so you start to, maneuver in that. There are places, some rightly, some wrongly, that you have to sort of accommodate to. And I think, for that to be healthy, there needs to be enough freedom for people to continue to follow their own passions and their own interests. We all come under some, level of, regulation with what we do.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, we can't just be completely free agents, I don't think. But there's a part to it that you have to navigate that that tension. And for years, and the challenge for me was that it takes a ton of work, and you don't make a ton of money. But it takes a ton of work to get into a position, and then a ton of more work to get tenured, and then a lot more work than to develop a reputation. And so as you build that increasingly, and this is part of what was so difficult for me through this period, as you build that, if you find yourself in a context where you're constantly compromising for one reason or another, you start to have to weigh, well, I've done all this work, but I have to compromise in order to continue to stay in whatever this job is. And then you're in this kind of constant double feed loop that it's really hard to get out of. And the way I got out of it was I just ended up leaving. And that was one of the harder things. I didn't know how hard it was until about a year afterwards. And I remember just sort of sitting down and kind of weeping, because I was reflecting on my resignation, which amounted to like 2 paragraphs of a letter kind of outlining why I was leaving and kind of stipulating some of the problems that I saw. And I handed it to a guy, and that was it. And I walked away from, 17 years of very hard work with not a lot to show for it financially. And then it's just gone. And that's a very difficult place to, and you're constantly doubting yourself. Like, what are you talking about? Compromise. Like, just keep compromising. It's fine. Okay. Stay safe, Brad.
I want to know how we got to this point before we rush past it.
Yeah.
So
sorry.
No, but that's good to orient to where we're going, because it does underscore meaning into the seasons that led up to it, for sure. As you mentioned, 17 years working towards something. Like here you are at Durham, you're getting your PhD. I'm sure it was much like my husband's experience at the University of Nottingham, where you're working around the best theologians and the biblical study scholars in the world. And you're like, yes, your heart's just exploding. You're like, this is what I want to do. These are my people. Like these are my people. You're like, okay, I'm going to do this. And you know,
yeah,
the naivete of our 20s of like, we don't know what's ahead. But yeah, the years of teaching, the years of moving your family, and, you know, just the investment that you make to give your whole life to this calling that you have, the papers, the hours and hours of research and study and grinding the keyboard, you know, to get articles published and all of that work, it starts to stack up in 17 years of work and investment into a career. And then you get to this place where it's a different experience, and suddenly you're having to weigh who you once were, making these easy decisions like, oh, I don't like this. I don't have the desire for this. It's not who I am. I'm going to move and I'm going to change. But when you've got 17 years and you start to feel something's out of alignment, and you've got 4 kids, you've got a wife, that kind of decision becomes a lot more of a cost. And it can feel like walking to the cross and literally dying to yourself. And can feel like the persecution that Christ faced and all of that. So, as much as you're comfortable in your window of tolerance within yourself and whatever feels okay for you, tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you when you started to feel things were out of alignment, you started to feel opposition, and you started to sense that there was a looming decision for you to have to make to go in another direction. What was that like for you?
Yeah, I think early on in kind of navigating the academy for me, there were little seed beds or little pieces of little experiences that made me think that I wasn't entirely suited to be an academic in that way. A lot of it just had to do with like the ends. I was still trying to figure out and articulate what it is that I was doing. In the academy, and you know what was the purpose behind what I was doing. I've got better language for it now than I did then. Like, what are our aims? What are our goals? What's the task that's in front of me as an academic? And there are little pieces that they're like little sort of interior, like, I mean, sometimes it was pretty obvious. Like, I don't know why we would use that reading strategy. I don't see the value in it or the help that it brings to people. But other times it was just kind of like a slow, kind of dull, like, inclination away from some of what I was doing. And so, but through the course of teaching in my early part of my career, there was such an excitement about participating with people, being present with them in their own journey. I enjoyed, for the most part, the undergraduate, the school in Seattle that I taught at first. Is really my first full-time teaching job. I taught part-time in Hawaii for about 1.5 years. But the time in Seattle was for me, a rich experience. I was around great colleagues in the College of Ministry. I learned a lot from them, and we ended up with some great students that came through the College of Ministry and the program there. I learned a lot from them. I was able to. One of the great things about that experience was I was able to, really for the first time, as I was in a classroom. The beauty of the classroom for me was that it allowed me to articulate thoughts over a long period of time. so much of what passes for communication that I had experienced were a lot of kind of one-off, sort of like you want a soundbite, and you want somebody to give you, this half hour or these 45 minutes, and then you present your paper, and then you go off, and that's a conclusion that you draw. The nice thing about 15 weeks with students was that you could develop ideas over a longer stretch. It's also really demanding, and so it means you kind of got to, like, if you say something in week 2, in week 14, you're coming to a different conclusion. You need to kind of reconcile those things in some way.
Yeah.
But anyway, there were pieces of that I just felt, I really fell in love with, and I felt as home as I've ever felt.
That's such a beautiful statement.
I mean, I felt as I felt that I was as much myself as I had ever felt in my life. But I think a lot of people also on this podcast would relate to that, because all of us have this tension when we come to the place where we're evaluating and bargaining with a cost to, like, then follow Christ on a whole different journey. Mm-hmm. We are in this tension of that sense that I was called to do this, and it is when I feel most like myself, when I feel most at home, when, like the movie Chariots of Fire, when he says, when I run, I feel God's presence. Well, alongside that, again, back to that idea of working within a context, you start to see the way in which, my experience at least, was the way in which universities would commodify what I was doing. Mm-hmm. And I started to witness firsthand some of the dissonance between what was being said in public and what was then being articulated in private. And I started to, and again, this is my own personal experiences with this, is that there was a real lack of what I saw as, like, a consistent faith throughout the organization. And I started to wonder what it was that I was actually serving with this program. I knew that there were moments where students were really meeting with, aspects of their faith, and they were learning. They would tell me as much. They would go on to do things that would suggest as much as well. But I just met so regularly and routinely. I came up against situations where there was a real disconnect between faithful witness to our tradition and what we believe in the interior life in private conversations, typically to do with the running of the institution, and then the public face that was put on it. And I just, to me, and and the way that I was I was orienting myself and my view of God, that just was not satisfactory. And so I started to kind of wrestle with, how much longer can I do this? So I kind of carried with me a growing suspicion that the type of Christian institutions that I was a part of and had been a part of had some dangers that were associated with them in terms of how they conducted their business. What was it that they were ultimately doing? How were they doing it? And what sort of environment were they encouraging? And so for me, the trauma had kind of started to, or the disconnect had sort of started to get kicked off by, feeling a little out of sorts with the academy more generally, living in a context and working in a context where I saw people playing kind of fast and loose with Christian spirituality. They deployed it when it was convenient, and other times it was all about the bottom dollar. And so there was a loss for me of integrity. There were times where I felt like, and what this all was kind of orbiting was just what it is that we serve when we teach. And so much of it was driven to those external sort of exterior structures that we kind of talked about. Like, here's a pattern, here's a program, here's a context. Our context is right. You're definitely going to get it. If you follow ABC, you're going to end up with this. And it wasn't so much attuned, not in my mind, legitimately or honestly, with the interior life. And I had kind of, in my own way, gotten swept up in that, even though I was, I was critical of the environments that I was in, and I was suspicious of what they were doing. But, in hindsight, I had sort of gotten, caught up in that myself. And attention to the inner life and to the spiritual life and to spiritual formation and the habits that we cultivate, and their effectiveness, again, I think was something that I found is in these contexts was really lacking. And then if you lay into that, in my experience, what became kind of spiritually abusive leadership that I was under, it really sort of cracked or split my capacity to handle it. And I had gone through a lot of emotional and I think mental and spiritual sort of fragmentation and dislocation or whatever. And it got to a point where I just had to say, there's a choice to be made here. You can continue on with what you're doing, and you can try to have a spiritual life. It has for sure suffered. I'm not sure that living where you are is going to heal it in any way, like remaining where you are. But you'll keep your vocation, and you'll be able to continue doing what you're doing, and you'll get paid. And or you can walk away from that with the hope that the dark spaces in your own spiritual life some light can be shed on them, and you can give God space to come in. The irony of it all, if I could put a fine point on it, is that I was in an environment that prided itself on the renewal sort of approach, the activity of the Spirit in our lives. And the only thing that it was doing was creating these dark spaces of relationship with God, because it had built up a system that didn't actually want that. It wanted, more numbers, more students in the seats. It wanted you to speak about your like an encounter with God had to be in a certain form, and there wasn't a way. There just wasn't a way or a place for you to hear from God if it was outside that sort of form. I mean, I had been, really run into the ground with, what I was researching, lots of like negativity towards me and my teaching, and yeah, it was a really trying time. And it ended up being the type of thing where the lack of support is what, that ground me down initially. And then I started questioning everything that I was doing. Where I was. So it's kind of a rambling way of saying that's, and you get to this place in it, I think, where, like none of those habits or disciplines that you were working on actually help, or at least, like, I've talked with Mike about this to some extent, is that, the spiritual disciplines, like, learning how to, like developing prudence in your life, it works if it's working towards something. If it's prudence for prudence sake, then you might as well do anything in life, because it may or may not affect your interior life. There has to be something that you're aware of an other, you're aware of something else that's outside of you that you want to serve and that you want to become a disciple of through these offices. And that's one of the nice things for me through these activities. That's one of the nice things about like a narrowed space. Yeah. Is that you start to recognize that like spiritual disciplines or prayer or reading scripture, it's a single scent. It's a broken twig that pushes you forward in that relationship with God. It is not the answer. It's not the destination. You're moving towards something. And so much of what I was finding in the academy and where I was teaching was that the destination was what we were doing. It was the end. And so many of my colleagues, I don't think, they didn't share that vision either, and it became really challenging to be there. Anyway, sorry, I rambled a little bit.
No, I'm tracking with you. on the tracking theme.
Good.
Are you familiar with the poet David Whyte?
Yeah.
I've probably referenced him many times at this point through all the different interviews we've done, but he was really grounding for me during my platform to table journey. But I remember listening to one of his interviews on Being with Krista Tippett. He said, if you really want to die to yourself, go right into the belly of the beast, work for a nonprofit. Especially a nonprofit that is run by a family-run nonprofit. I mean, they're just the complexities and the politics and the lack of organization and like all of the things that are just inherent. And here I am, I'm running a nonprofit and I'm like, oh, Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy. I don't want to create this same kind of an environment. But man, we can get in the crosshairs of that. And like, I didn't know that I was signing up for those kinds of complexities when I was 19 years old. And I'm like, here am I, Lord, send me. Or maybe when Mike was, in his mid-30s, graduating from his PhD, that what exactly he was walking into, working in the realm of academia with a nonprofit university. But I definitely hear you and what you've experienced, and you have basically what I hear you saying is you were in this crucible and where you said you were ground down without support, intense questioning and scrutiny around what you were teaching. Yeah, that sounds like it makes you question yourself, and then that strips you of a certain level of agency to feel empowered in your decision-making ability, to stand in who you are, to stand true to what you know to be true about the faith and what you're teaching. So stripping somebody of that agency is abusive and extremely harmful, like you were saying, to the interior world and to the interior life. And as you were talking about these different spiritual practices like prudence and virtues and things like that you wanted to hold fast to, and you just couldn't find place for them in that world. I'm reminded of when I was at that place of turning towards the table and having to evaluate the cost and make that decision to ultimately go that route and surrender my 20-year career. There was a book, Necessary Endings, by Dr. Henry Cloud. Definitely not an academic by your standards, but I found it to be a helpful book, practically. He talked about all about in that book, John 15, and the vineyard and how the Lord prunes the things in our life, and we have to allow him to prune those things in our life that are actually blocking the ability for things to grow that are of him. And so as you were talking, I was thinking about that. Well, you have to be in an environment where those things can grow and bloom and flourish and blossom. So here you are again in this place where it's a different context, but you are who you are, where you're faced with this decision. Like, can the things I know to really be true about me and what I truly desire to do in my career, what I really loved, can these things flourish and grow here? And can I be true to myself here and be true to who God is? And what a responsibility you had on your shoulders to actually be training up seminarians, people who could potentially be in a pulpit training other people. So what was on the other side for you? How did that feel? What did that look like for you when you walked away from that career?
Yeah, I mean, that was the real challenge, the final hurdle to get over. I think leaving was the easy decision. The harder decision is actually doing it. And part of what made it easy too, at least to come to the conclusion that I needed to do it, was seeing so many people that I knew go through similar things. And then being the one that was left behind, they left, they were fired, they run out of town, those types of things. What got me there was a real crisis of just, my soul. I mean, I stopped wanting to do anything. Historically, as I've kind of told my story, I had no desire to read. I was just trying to get through the rudiments of the coursework that I was doing. That's all they demanded as well. I mean, it was not a place that was, at the time I was doing it, and we all were doing it to the best of our abilities, but we were in an environment that did not encourage a really strong sort of experience for the students. But that was okay with me on one level. And this is part of the compromise, because I had no energy to give to it. I was completely tapped out. And, I would go in, I'll give you an example. I would go in the morning, and you've kind of heard my story up to this point, so this is not who I am. I would go in the morning, and there would be many, many days where I would get to my desk, my office desk, and I would answer the few emails that were there, because there was a requirement to turn around emails really quickly. And then I would sit for 3 hours, and I would literally sit and do nothing. And I would try, I would pick up a book. It would be a book. I said, okay, I can't read these new books that I need to be reading, but these old ones that I know I really like, I'll read one of those just to get things going. I'd read a paragraph, and I couldn't do it anymore. Aww. I lost the desire to interpret, read texts in the original language. I lost the desire to writing, and the movement between ideas and paper, which had become a lot easier and more fluid for me, was gone. And I just broke down. I mean, I tell everybody, whatever I was and whatever got me to the place where I was just completely broke. I could not function anymore. I was not able to do what I used to be able to do. The only thing I could do was, I really was literally just sit in my office chair and then perform periodically as I needed to in the classroom setting. And it took me, the build up to doing a classroom, a live session, which were all video at that point. I needed an hour beforehand to just get myself
Brad,
in a position where I could function, and then afterwards I would just collapse again. And that, go ahead.
What you're describing, I just want to put a name to this, just to validate your experience, but also to help listeners who might be in a similar situation. What you're describing, and you can say if it rings true for you or not, but it sounds to me like dorsal vagal shutdown, which is a state that the nervous system goes into to actually protect oneself from experiencing more hurt and trauma in the environment that they're in. It's like a mammal who is being chased by a lion and plays dead. And they do that because their nervous system is actually wired by God, their creator, to do it, to protect itself from ultimate physical, spiritual, psychological, in a human context, death. And so that makes sense 100% that you felt that way. And it's actually speaks to the level of trauma that you were experiencing in your body at the time, that you were experiencing spiritually and emotionally at the time. But it also, in a bigger back out, it speaks to how beautifully God wired you and how much he loved you to wire you that way, to have that sense of ability in your body to protect itself. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is the definition of it, because that was sort of that freezing and incapacitation was exactly what happened.
And your ability to gear up to teach that class, that's actually called functional freeze.
Oh, okay.
It's like you've heard of fight, flight, or freeze.
Yeah.
There's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn nowadays. But there's also the term functional freeze, where you're able to kind of like in a robotic sense do what you have to do to survive your context, but your ability to be emotionally connected, to feel that sense of connection to your surroundings is a part of the brain that's shut off when you're actually experiencing trauma. So your body, your mind, your spirit, just not able, you're physically not able to feel that sense of connection. But the functional freeze is more of just doing the thing to survive.
Well, that was it.
Horrible.
Well, and layering it in for me was, I think there was some like, I didn't have this demand on other people, I don't think, but there was a demand on me. It's like, why are you like this? You can handle this, like just pick yourself up and, get on with it. And I was incapacitated, and it was the sort of thing that was, it's a hard thing to admit. It's a hard thing to kind of wrestle with, because there's parts of it that, looking outside, looking in, it's like, you've got all of these great things. You've got a great family. You've been successful in some areas. And then to kind of talk to people about, well, I'm actually like incapacitated most of the day, functionally with what I'm doing. It's like, yeah, well, why? And that shouldn't happen. That shouldn't happen to you. And it helped me realize that there's things that happen to people that they're not contingent on, all of the successes that you have. They can enter into your life, these traumas or these moments, in ways that you just never expected to enter. And they can penetrate those good things, because you can get dislocated in ways that you never expected, or they're a smaller part of your life. And for me, it helped me. What I was kind of coming to terms with was what we were alluding to earlier, was that the sort of spirituality that had kind of been built up in me over the course of my life was one that was, I think I could say this autobiographically now, was pretty thin, to be honest. And looking back on it, when those pieces of my life that were, I'd worked towards, they were the things that God had given me as a result of the efforts that I'd put in. And when I found myself in a situation where, I would pray against the wicked man who was oppressing me, and I would pray for a way out of it. And then finally I was so narrow, I just pray for the peace to be able to handle this situation. And none came of it. I started to that's where those cracks entered in for me spiritually. And I started to think, well, maybe this whole thing is a joke. And that was the tipping point for me, where I really just plummeted. And but the plummeting was everything just sort of like, for me, it was a way to put it is, I started to say, okay, you were this guy, you had this training, you were teaching these people, you were speaking here, you were writing these things. And I remember thinking, like, none of it really matters. Like, genuinely, none of that really matters at all if the interior life that I'm living is not true. Like, I don't want to be doing that if this is all something that doesn't make sense. So what ended up happening is like, as everything started to close in and I felt really isolated and things got really dark, it just kind of, I had to sit there and say, okay, well, I'm here now. So this is where I'm going to be. This is what I'm going to think through. This is what I'm going to live into. And if at the end of this doesn't work, and I didn't know which path that would take. I mean, I had a friend who had committed suicide. I could wrap my mind around how he got to that place. You know what I mean?
Oh, Brad.
So, well, yeah. I mean, it was a very difficult season, but it was one of those things
it makes complete sense that you would be able to relate to your friend. That makes complete sense. When you're literally trapped in a little box, you've got a family of 4, your whole spiritual, emotional, and concept of self is being challenged, and to a point where you feel like you're ground down, like you said.
And
it leads to despair.
Yeah, and in hindsight now, only in hindsight for me could I see this. One of the beauties of that, if you can come through that, and the only way I made it through is with friends. So like your husband,
yes,
Mike.
And I want to hear about this too. Yeah, go ahead.
But if you can come through that stripping away is really the only way I think that you can come to terms with. For me, at least, I think there has to be some form of that stripping away in order to get to the real sort of spiritual life.
Absolutely. And what you're describing about the stripping away, so many people now that I'm sure you're privy to, like St. Teresa of Avila and St. John of the Cross, as they talk about the dark night and going into the different mansions, there does come that place, it seems, through all of the great saints, and then just all of us. When we're going into a deeper level of spiritual maturity, there is a stripping or a refining in the fire where something is purified and comes forth like gold, the thing that you really want to keep and take with you. So as you're talking about the stripping away, are you able to identify and articulate exactly what it is that was challenged in that time in terms of your ideas about God or yourself or about others, where you were able to get to that place where you said, none of it matters if I can't have this?
Yeah, I think that notions that there was a singular plan, I think was, or that there was there were places where as things got sort of, like I say, like they got stripped away and things become narrower and narrower, the ability for me to sort of say, well, I'm an academic and my academic training has taught me this.
Yes.
And I remember teaching students about this. Ugh. Even the systems that I knew, like there were times I would sit down, I would have these like rant sessions all by myself on a walk. I couldn't really pray very well. And then later I would say like, well, you remember what you would teach about wisdom literature, and you would teach students that this is how this works. And I realized that those, like that ability to kind of formulate an idea or a system for me was incapable of penetrating the place that the only thing that could answer me was God. And I knew I had a little bit of, I was a little worried about that, to be honest, because I didn't know exactly how God might answer. And like I say, I think I'm still in the midst of it. But there were, we talked about this before we started, is that I have a bio. Like this is what I've trained to do. This is what I've done. And I'm at a place now where there's big chunks of my life where it doesn't mean anything to me at all. And not because I just want to do away with it. Like I would still love to be teaching. I would still love to be active in that way. But at the end of the day, none of that is going to build a system that's going to insulate you from this, like some of these traumas, unless you have a really strong sort of spiritual grounding where the inner life has been tried and tested, and you've been able to say, like, this is going to be fine. Like, I'm going to be like, I can manage these traumas because I it's not contingent like on the exterior life. Like the exterior life is very, we need to work at this because that's how we engage with the, the created order and the material culture that God has given to us. And we need to be responsible for that. But at the end of the day, those systems and structures aren't going to get you to a healthy spiritual life. And I don't think I could have come to that like on my own. And I one other thing I would add is that there were many times and still sometimes where I don't want to go through it. And there were even with the hindsight of like the benefit of seeing some of the real value in it, I couldn't do it again. I'll say it that way. Or I don't feel like I could do it again. Like if someone said, you get all of this, if you go through this again, I don't think I would choose it.
Wow.
It was challenging in ways that I just never expected challenged. And
well, it certainly sounds like it. One of the things my husband has shared with me that I don't know if you would say this to be true in your bio as if you're an expert in, but he said that quite a bit about Job and Job's accusers and just the discourse between him and both his accusers and between him and God, and like where he ultimately ended up and said, now I've always known of you, but now I know you. So does your understanding of Job and your Old Testament studies play into any of these kinds of walks that you had with God, where you would go on these rants and just try to figure things out? Like, I'm just really curious about that. Like,
Job's a good example of what I know and my inability to access it in the hard moments. And what I mean by that is that, the story of Job is such that what he went through not of his own creation. It was the dialogue between God and Satan that brought this upon him. And his accusers articulate a really formulaic sort of worldview in which, you suffer because you did something wrong.
Right.
And if you're suffering, that's the cause. You just need to take an inventory of your life and figure out why that happened. And the whole time Job is protesting his innocence, and the readers, of Job, they know that the friends are wrong because we have access to the first dialogue between God and Satan. But the friends don't. Everybody in the story, internal to the story, is working under this cloud that they don't know exactly what happened. So they're accessing these systems of thought. They're accessing these spiritual systems for them, this kind of worldview, that has worked for them.
Right. And
the whole time you're like, well, no, of course not. But if you listen to what the friends are saying, they're lovely things. Like I did this exercise one time in one of my classes. The undergrads will forgive me for kind of tricking them. Where
tell us.
I started the year by just giving them 10 verses of scripture, and I said just rank them 1 to 10 of the ones that you love. Like you love them all. I know you love scriptures, but just put them in order. Well, they didn't know this, but 5 of the 10 quotes were from Job's friends, and I don't remember the exact numbers. I actually did a percentage of it, but 3 of the quotes of the friends were always in the top 5. And
wow.
I think the percentage of one of those quotes being the number one selection for 120 students was somewhere 90%. 90% of the students picked one of Job's friends' quotes for their favorite scripture that I gave. Because I gave them quotes, but without the scripture reference, So they didn't know what it was.
Wow.
And then I would tell them when we would get to Job, I'd say, by the way, you all like their friends. And it's only to illustrate that there's there's the ability to say something that is, and I didn't question them on this. I said, there's the ability to say something that is true about God, but is not true to the situation within which God and you are experiencing life.
Wow.
And so Job's friends were able to say something that's true about God, but when it actually got to the conclusion, Job, God says to Job's friends, "You're wrong about me." Not wrong in that God is a righteous and just God, but just wrong situationally with where this person was. And that was, I think, one of the fine points for me about, like, that to me is a good illustration of my own experiences, is that there was lots of scripture. There was lots of things I was doing. As an Anglican. I had a very strong prayer life in terms of daily and the daily office, taking communion every week and all the things that were associated with that, and trying to develop ascetical practices. And there were points at which all of those good things could not penetrate that enclosure that I was in. It had to be that voice of the Lord out of the whirlwind. And it's not to say that I was Job and I was innocent of everything. It's not to just one for one kind of situate my story in relationship with Job. But I think the upshot to all of that is that the only way in which we're going to understand sometimes how things work is by just a full tilt encounter with God. And there's something about Job's life that I admire, that is this real persistence through all of this adversity, not to give up on that singular truth that I didn't do anything that was wrong. I'm not going to accommodate to the system, even though I was probably a proponent of the same system. These were his friends, so it's likely that Job held to the same sort of ideas that his friends held to. I'm not going to accommodate to that system, because what I'm experiencing, what I'm living, that's not the truth of it. And it can't encapsulate or kind of encompass the truth of this, because it's not what is right in this situation. And so there's I think you and I talked about this sense of honesty, where that has become critically important to me, there's times I'm wrong when I say, if I say something like, God doesn't listen to me or something like this. I say that, but I'm probably not. I think God is listening, but there's a piece to that sort of honesty. It's like, this is where I'm at in this moment. And Job persists. And in the end, of course, he's answered. And it's interesting that his answer, God's answer and redress to Job is not, it's not maybe what we would expect. It's a questioning of Job, like, where were you? And there's a restoration part to it, but it's not like God sits Job down and just explains to him, here's why I did what I did. That's not the answer that's given to him. But there is this encounter, and there's something that's, I think, for me, that's become the singular, that's the single quest, really, for me. And so the teaching, the writing, the researching, the education, I walked away from that because the context that I was in, I don't think had that as its quest. I think some people that I taught with did, some of the students did, but the system that I was a part of was not doing that. It was much more like Job's friends than Job. And I just eventually, and some of it was kicking and screaming. So I can't claim to have just taken a full tilt stand, no, not going any further. Some of it was by, I need to survive. I was frozen. And so, and that was a place too, where these stories, but until you've experienced them.
Right. It's a whole different
thing. It really is.
It's a whole different thing.
Yeah.
That is such a beautiful, you were able to articulate your story through the lens of Job from that perspective of that story so clearly. That was really, really cool. And I loved how you did that with your students. What a really awesome exercise, just to bring it into, to give them this awareness, lightly, hey, we've all got it in us. None of us really know. And who, those.
Well, it's that distancing that's
Right.
part of the challenge of Scripture and using it exclusively, is that like the education of Scripture and the reading of Scripture has the risk, and I think probably more so than we see is a reality. It puts you at a distance or a move from what it's actually inviting you into, which is that full, real relationship with God. And what I mean by that is that when you read Job, if you read it as a story, it has the ability very quickly to dislocate you from that. Too can be your experience. That too can be
Right.
what you end up walking
Right.
through. So, the object lessons are: don't be their friends, and persist like Job does. But until you're actually in it, and you can't, your world is closed in, and you cannot see
Right.
purpose. What's the purpose behind all of this? It's not. It hits you in a different way.
Hits
and
you in a different way.
And you start to look less for the systems. Job rejected his friends. You look less for that, and you're like, basically Job's plea is only God can answer me. And,
Right.
yeah. So
we're right at the top of the hour, but one more question about Job that'll kind of lead us towards maybe the last part of your story. How have you found permission within yourself to fully express the emotions and that have maybe come up from the fallout? And how have you found maybe the story of Job, or maybe through the context of your friendships that you talked about, a pathway to process those emotions and to come into maybe a deeper intimacy with God on the other side of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, the emotional side to it, there's times where I didn't process it well.
Mm-hmm.
So it was anger, not tethered to engagement. So there's the anger of engagement and frustration with silence. I slipped into seasons where I was like, I don't see the point in this anymore, and I don't know, why I'm going through this. They were fleeting, thanks be to God. But I do think that there's definitely room. The Psalms are great about this as well.
Yeah.
And they're always contextualized. One of the things I tried to do, I didn't always do it very well, but I tried to do regularly when I was really frustrated, was I tried to articulate my anger or my sorrow or loss or whatever, in a context of prayer. So I would try to bring it before the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of accessing that psalmist vision of lament or cursing can be a form of praise if brought before the Lord. I wasn't good at it, so again, I kind of felt like I knew the structure. I kind of knew where to look for this, and I kind of knew how to do it. But there were times where I'm like, I don't want to say I'm angry. I spoke my mind, but now I don't want to say that I trust you. But I know that's probably what I need to say. But yeah, I think there's a place that you get where, at least for me, where it wasn't satisfactory for me to say any longer, this is how I was raised. This is what I was trained on. You say these words, and that was a personal thing. So there's other examples like my mother, for example, in her seasons of trial and suffering, it was all about praise. It was just being thankful. And that's not to discredit her response. I think that is an adequate response, and it's a very beautiful response to periods of suffering. But for me, there was a tremendous amount of frustration in the silence of God and what I saw as being the injustices around me. Not just that I was suffering, but other people were suffering through as well. To be able to sort of just give voice to that. One of the things that was a real help, which you then touched on, was finding, and this was a grace of God, was finding friends. Your husband's one of them, and one of the main ones that could hear that and not run.
Right.
because
or not be Job's friends.
Yeah, and just have the ability to sort of say, yeah, like I get it. And not just give license, like free license to just sort of like say, I'm just going to say this and nothing else. I think, good friendships and good spiritual friendships in those seasons have to have the ability to sort of hear it towards something, hear it constructively in some capacity. And by the grace of God, I had friends that I could do that with. I don't know. I mean, if I was going it alone entirely, I don't know where I would be.
Yeah. No.
And it's hard to do it. It's hard to, wife is the best friend, but it's really hard to process that inside a relationship when she's still, she's not going through these same things or going through these things in the way that I am. It's hard for that to land in her lap and for her to be able to sort of process, because she's got to kind of keep going. The household has to keep going.
Yes.
So to find those pathways or avenues through friends to kind of, say these things and then kind of move through it has been invaluable. Yeah. They're harder to find. They're definitely out there, but they are a real gift from God when you do find them. Yes. They're not something that not everybody is going to be able to follow you down some of these paths.
Yeah.
Without flinching.
Yeah, I think
that makes sense.
It's hard because when you're in that state, you're already so exhausted and maybe in despair and maybe feeling quite suspicious of people. But you do also have to be really discerning because you're so vulnerable and you can't just share your story with just anyone. So really relying on the grace of God to lead you to the right people, to be able who can hold that story.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Is knowing when not to share your story.
Not to share, yeah.
Is not an unimportant piece, because it's not something that everybody, first of all, needs to hear in that kind of raw way, but also is going to be able to hear it. You're going to get advice that's going to land again, well-intentioned, well-meaning, true in some register about God, but maybe doesn't apply to your story, and that can be you got to be careful. So,
especially in the Christian context, we can come, they're like Job's friends. We can immediately want to rush to, and like you said, there's all those scriptures, like God blesses unity, and forgive your brother 70 times 7, all these scriptures. And like, even just the example of Christ, who was able to like sit and wash the feet of those who had denied him and betrayed him. And what exactly does that look like practically for me in this context? There's so much wrestling, but ultimately it can be go ahead.
Yeah, you bring up an important piece to that I think I underestimated was, I think I was looking a lot of the time. I was looking for justice. For things when what I really needed was the situation to be redeemed or atoned, and they're different things, because they justice can have a kind of a tit for tat, an exchange of things, and that's you're not always going to get that. And atonement allows you to sit in a register where, and if you can like dig into it, where it's not so much about just getting a tit for tat. It's about finding a way in which that situation that was a breach or there was a problem can actually be restored. And I don't think that I was able to. It's funny because I was doing a lot of work on Leviticus and like atonement theory and those types of things, and I never really thought about that. I think my prayer was always in the context of, these wrongs have been done to me. They need to be made right by this person having this happen and this happen. And I think the piece that I needed to look for a little bit more was like, and this has been part of the helpful kind of interior sort of drive, is that this isn't about making that situation right or that situation right. This is about like the development of your own interior life. And that can be the redemption. That can be the thing that comes out of this that is good.
Yeah.
You just start to look for something different other than just, notions of like simple justice. Not that those aren't, that those are bad things to look for, but you're looking for something else. It's kind of shifting the register. So anyway.
Yeah. Let's transition to the final question that I want to ask you is, if you were to talk with somebody who was in your shoes, maybe they're in academia and they are in a position where, like a lot of higher ed institutions are, especially in the culture or the climate that we're in America now, like, and they're being pushed to pursue power, popularity, success, numbers, money, the bottom line, at the expense of who they are, especially if they're seminary professors. What if they're at that point of tension where they're starting to evaluate the cost of like sacrificing their career for the time being, or maybe permanently or whatever, or staying, if they're at that point of tension, what might you say to them where they're at, just to give them some grounding or encouragement? What would your advice be?
That's a good question. Part of me feels like I'm ill-suited to give advice on this just yet.
Yeah,
but
you've said you're still on the journey, but
what
would you wish you would have heard at that point?
That's how I'm hearing what you're asking. And I think that's like a really good thing to think about for me. I think initially I would contextualize it by saying I'm sympathetic for those who don't do what I did and leave. I understand the reasons for staying. And for committing to some level of, just finding a happy place, and whether it's you compromising something or you're just becoming a person who says yes to everything. I understand that, because it's
right.
very difficult to make that shift. And I had the advantage on one level is I had a separate set of skills that I could access as a carpenter. So, and not everybody has that. But I think the thing I would say is, and I hope this lands correct, or how I want it to land, is that be as honest as you possibly can spiritually, and remember that there are so many more important things than an academic career to live by, and the run up against that I found was that even all of those exterior things that I had kind of cultivated, and I, to some extent, was fortunate, like I was trying to get to earlier, is that all those external things fell apart. And they will fall apart. It's not a matter of if they do, they just will at some point, whether that's now or whether that's in the age to come. And so I think leaning into like a strong and honest inventory of your own, your own spiritual life, and what the context that you're in is doing to that, how it's influencing it. Is it cultivating it? Are you growing spiritually? Are you able to make sense of, your own prayer life, your own spiritual disciplines, whatever they are? And are you able to find like that connection to the world, or are you finding yourself increasingly slipping into areas of compromise? And if you are, I think in a lot of ways you're duty bound to sort of take, you're duty bound to your own like spiritual well-being to take an assessment of that. And as difficult as that may be, I think the ultimate rewards are so much more than choosing the other path. So, but again, I understand it. I mean, it was a decision I arrived at over the course of about 5 years. The day I did it, I walked around campus 3 times. I had the paper in my hand, and each time I walked past the office, I said, "No, not now." And That was after 5 years. So it's a very difficult decision to get to. But
yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, Brad, I really appreciate your vulnerability and your honesty. Is there any particular way you would like to close us out today? I always give that opportunity to our guests on the show.
I do have maybe I could read a poem.
Sure.
I was thinking about one of the things as we were talking was about a Bob Dylan, a set of Bob Dylan lyrics where it's Love Minus Zero, I think is the song. And
awesome.
he talks about, I mean, I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to do two. I'm going to
gotcha.
In it is this line where he says there's no success like failure. And failure's no success at all. But he's talking about this love in his life. And I love that line because there is something about failing. And I think, Christians, we have a hard time of kind of associating failure with a spiritual life going forward, because everything has to be about this movement forward. Yep. Whereas sometimes this failure, and I don't mean, for me, I do feel like it's falling on my face, but there's these wrong turns that we take sometimes, that it's those wrong turns or those things that happen in our life that are failures that can be really a great building ground for the Lord. But for the Lord to operate in those seasons of failure. But I think I'm going to read a poem, if that's all right.
Please.
Instead of reading that lyric. Okay.
That's okay.
So I share a poem with you.
Sure.
Here we go. Slow down for a moment. Take a careful breath and look at the stationary flower. Pretty, right? Stop and enter into its time. Motionless, still, acting in such patience as to be frozen to us in time. Now go about your life for a month or so. Return to the flower and you will find it gone. It was here in its fullness, being as nature made it to be, living in its own circle, present to the fullness of time, and intersecting with any life in time. Now go about your life, little flower. God will return in a month or so to see your fullness in time.
Wow.
So, a sense of passage of time and everything. So
that's beautiful.
Anyway.
That's beautiful. Who wrote that poem? Where did you get that poem from?
I wrote it.
You wrote that poem?
Yeah.
It's beautiful, Brad. Oh, I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Do you want to tell us anything about it? Like the process of writing it or anything?
Yeah, I mean, thinking a lot about, especially as I age and others age around me, about, the spiritual life and what it looks like. And just a sense of timelessness, a sense of passage of time, and the importance of intersecting in I think the idea of a flower. So I've been working with notions of circles and lines with the passage of time, and in some other poems, and how each flower looks the same as every other flower, but there's something uniquely important about each that are there, and they just sit there and they just are what they are. They intersect with everything else that comes around it, and then it's gone.
Yeah, and then it's gone.
And so and then the Lord is coming back to see us in our fullness. So, yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful.
There's a little dark side probably to that in my own life, but it's this idea of being a flower as best you can, and living the life the best that you can, and intersecting with as much as you can. And so
it makes me think of Matthew 6, where it says, "This is how the flowers grow." And then also it makes me think of Therese of Lisieux, the little flower. She was a little flower. Yeah.
Well, both of those were actually a part of it. So it's, her life is this sort of simple thing. Yeah. So.
Right. I love that. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Please tell Corey, thank you for wrangling the kids while we have been eating all this time this afternoon. It has been an honor to get to know you. It has been an honor to stand and receive and behold your story. And it is an encouragement to me, and I believe it's going to be encouragement to other people. So thank you for your vulnerability and your honesty and just for being here.
My pleasure, Sarah. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a great experience for me. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for joining us today on the Platform to Table podcast. This episode concludes the first season of our podcast. As we prepare for our next season, we'd love to hear your feedback. Send us a message on Instagram or our website, platformtotable.com. Subscribe and sign up for our newsletter to be the first to know when season 2 goes live. Until then, I'd like to invite you to join us on Monday nights at a Platform to Table Anonymous meeting. PTA is a 12-step spiritual reformation group for Christian leaders who are struggling with compulsive performing or other codependent behaviors on their platform of leadership. We also have a storytelling monastic retreat, a contemplative writing pilgrimage, and a national park hiking pilgrimage coming next spring. For more information, visit our website or email me at connect@platformtotable.com.